Hello and welcome to the top 10 quotes series for A Christmas Carol. In today's video we will be exploring the theme of isolation and loneliness and connecting some quotations to this particular theme of isolation and loneliness. In this series I will be discussing all of the different themes within A Christmas Carol that haven't yet come up in the exam, so are likely to come up in the exam. So if you find these videos beneficial, then please feel free to comment, like and subscribe. Let me know if there are any particular themes that you'd like me to explore. As I am an examiner, I will also be referring to the assessment objectives, so AO1, AO2 and AO3. A brief explanation of what the AOs are is available in the description box below, so please familiarize yourself with the AOs so that you can maximize your marks in the exam. So let's get started. The first quotation is "as solitary as an oyster." Now this is a really iconic quotation from A Christmas Carol and one that's really easy to remember. So let's get into the analysis of it. So Dickens uses the word solitary here and the simile solitary as an oyster to colour the reader's view of Scrooge. An oyster lives alone at the bottom of the seabed, and this echoes Scrooge's lonely and isolated existence. So identifying it as a simile is you identifying writer's methods, so that will get you the marks for AO2, and then a link to the question when you're mentioning loneliness or isolation will enable you to get the marks for AO1. So let's get into analysing this in a little bit more detail for those of you who are wanting the top grades, so grade 7s, 8s and 9s. So Scrooge abhors human contact, that means hates human contact, preferring to eat his melancholy dinner alone in his melancholy tavern. Now this quotation we're going to analyse later on, but just linking two quotations together, embedding quotations, will allow you to get more marks for AO1. It has a hard exterior, so the oyster has a hard exterior, which alludes to Scrooge's solitude being self-inflicted. That means he puts it on himself. So he has the choice whether to be lonely or not, and he chooses to be lonely, but can sometimes contain a pearl. Perhaps Dickens is hinting to the reader that inside the harsh and hard exterior there exists a jewel, which is indeed the case in this novel. So this analysis of language, further analysis of language, gives you more marks for AO2. So remember that it's important to offer as many layers of interpretation as you can in your analysis. The second quotation is "Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern," which we've already seen in our previous analysis. Melancholy means to be sad or something that is depressing. We've got the repetition of the word melancholy here, which emphasizes Scrooge's loneliness and how his isolation is again self-inflicted. So identifying it as repetition will enable you to get the marks for AO2, and linking it to the question will enable you to get the marks for AO1. So I'm not going to keep repeating where you're going to get the marks for AOs, but I'm just trying to show you how the examiner would mark your work and what sort of things you need to implement within your writing. In addition to this, Scrooge's meal is personified, which shows how miserable it is. So we see this direct contrast to the Cratchit's meals being made here. So Scrooge likes to eat his meal alone, in a depressing state, in a isolated, lonely state, and this use of personification makes his meal even seem miserable. So if we compare this with a reference to the Cratchit dinner that is full of exuberance and joy because of the unification of the family and the unity within the family and how much they love each other, we see this direct contrast being made. So you can argue that Dickens is making this direct contrast so that when Scrooge meets the Cratchits later on, he realizes what he's missing out on. In addition to this, the word tavern it means an inn or a pub, so perhaps you could argue that his home isn't a place of comfort, isn't a place of joy, isn't a place that makes him want to go there, so that's probably why he spends so much time at work. The third quotation is "a solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still." So the images of Scrooge alone in the school when we meet the young Scrooge in stave 2 in the schoolhouse are the first images to make us sympathise with the character and begin to understand him better as well. The word solitary here reminds us of the quotation solitary as an oyster. The fact that the word neglected is used here shows that he wasn't taken care of. It could also be a criticism of the Victorian schooling system. So Dickens often makes criticisms of the Victorian schooling system, and you might want to go ahead and do some research on that after you've finished this video. It could also be a criticism of Scrooge's parents being neglectful of him. The word solitary and the repetition of the word solitary, from solitary as an oyster and then solitary when it's given describing him as a child, emphasizes Scrooge's loneliness and how this very loneliness has followed Scrooge from childhood into adulthood. Throughout Stave 2, it is evident that Scrooge has had a difficult childhood. Therefore, whilst his miserly nature, so miserly means greedy or stingy nature, is not justified, the revelations of his childhood certainly allow us to be able to empathise with Scrooge a bit more. This is a quotation from Belle, Scrooge's fiancée, and she says, before leaving him, she says that another idol has displaced me, a golden one. So we've got the metaphor of a idol used here, implying Scrooge worships money, like idolizes money. And then the word displaced here suggests that his love for Belle has been replaced with his love for money. So Scrooge loses all valuable relationships because of his greedy nature, which results in him being isolated and lonely. We've got this quotation here where Dickens describes the Cratchit's family and their universal admiration for the meal that Mrs. Cratchit prepares. So the Ghost of Christmas Present shows Scrooge the importance of family and how being together and forming strong bonds is what brings joy. Again, a really direct criticism or contrast of Scrooge's self-inflicted isolation. So the word universal here is really impactful, because throughout the scene of the Cratchit's Christmas there's lots of language to emphasize the unity of the Cratchit family, which in turn emphasizes how lonely and isolated Scrooge has made himself, and also what he's missing out on by being so lonely and isolated and keeping himself away from people. The next quotation is, "Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always." So Fred, this is a quotation from Fred, Scrooge's nephew. So Fred pointing out to his wife that Scrooge is only harming himself by refusing to socialise with them probably rings more true with Scrooge now, so in this stage in the novel. Now, if you know the different stages and can recollect the way the events and the order of events, you are also given marks for AO3. So context, AO3 context isn't just the historical context, but also the context of things that happen, the events that happen within the novel, so knowing when things happen within the novel. So it probably rings more true with Scrooge now than it did before, when Fred spoke directly to him in Stave 1. Now that Scrooge has seen what he's missing out on and how truly lonely he has made his life, it's probably more impactful that Fred says this at this stage in the novel. We've got the use of hyperbole here, so the over-exaggerated language with the word suffers, used to exaggerate and emphasize how isolated Scrooge is, almost likening the pain that he feels as a lonely person to a pain that's almost physical, not just emotional. The next quotation is, "He frightened everyone away from him when he was alive to profit us when he was dead." This is a quotation from Mrs. Dilber when Scrooge is shown to have died, and Mrs. Dilber condemns Scrooge here, commenting that the taking of his property is his earthly retribution, so revenge or payback for the way he behaved on earth. The word frightened shows how he created this life of isolation on purpose and by himself. And then we've got the semantic field of business and money used to show the irony of how Scrooge refused to give to the poor while he was alive, so they've had no choice but to take from him now that he has died. So I'm going to make a link to AO3 context now about the Victorian era. The mercenary nature, so the ruthless nature of the charwoman, Mrs. Dilber, and Old Joe in the novel, maybe unsettling to watch for Scrooge when he sees him that this body has died. Remember, he doesn't know that it's his body at that time, but these people are stealing from him essentially now that he's died and selling his belongings on. It may be unsettling to watch for Scrooge and the Victorian rich, but they serve an integral purpose. These characters that steal from Scrooge or take his possessions once he's died are poor and have no other means of making money. Whilst their way of making money might be dislikable or unpleasant to watch, it shows that how desperate they are, so their desperation in a society that doesn't help them. This quotation is about Scrooge when he discovers his body is the body that has died in stave 4. Plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for was the body of this man. So we've got the list of adjectives to describe Scrooge, which describes him as that of a condemned, so a doomed or fated man, much like Marley was when he died, so much like Scrooge's friend Marley was when he died. We've got the rule of 3 here as well to emphasize how lonely and isolated Scrooge is, and will be if he dies in his current state of self-inflicted isolation. The next quotation is, "The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues." This is in the scene where Tiny Tim has died. So the simile of the Cratchits is given here to show how lifeless their life has become now that Tim has gone. This is a really good quote to compare with the exuberance they had during the Christmas meal and how this exuberance has now left them because of the demise of Tiny Tim. Now, another link to AO3 context. So infant and child death was incredibly common during the 19th century. So the death of Tiny Tim is a purposeful lesson for the contemporary readership, so the readership of the time, the Victorian readership, so that they can see how their ignorance of the poor affect innocent children. The death of Tiny Tim highlights how affected his family are because of his death and emphasises the importance of family and unity, which is again a direct contrast to Scrooge's death, because when Scrooge dies, he dies very much alone. Nobody is there for his funeral, nobody is there at his gravestone, nobody is there to mourn his death because of the way he behaved with people when he was alive. Whereas Tiny Tim's death is really, really sad. It's something that makes the readers feel sad. We see how upset his family are with his demise. We even see how upset Fred, somebody who doesn't know him, is. So the effect that Tiny Tim has made on people's lives, in contrast to the effect that Scrooge has had, is a really good way of combining these two ideas to emphasize the point of loneliness and isolation, and will enable you to achieve the top marks if you make them sort of comparisons, because it shows and convinces the examiner that you know the text really, really well. And then the final quotation, "I am as light as a feather." So this simile shows how heavy the burden of being a miser was for Scrooge. It also echoes Fred's words of how Scrooge only harms himself by being alone. It emphasizes how self-destructive living a lonely and isolated life is. The final stave shows how being kind and generous is something that doesn't only bring joy to those around you, but joy to yourself as well. It's only by being kind to yourself that you can truly be kind to others. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this top 10 series. In the next episode, we will be doing a different theme, another theme that hasn't come up in the exam. So if you found this beneficial or useful, please make sure that you subscribe to the channel so you can receive notifications for new videos, and we will upload on a weekly basis. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll see you next time.